The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $85 on a cold, bright Saturday morning, and Delbert Voss laughed loud enough that the crows on the fence line lifted off in a black scatter. It was the 12th of March, 1983, at the Halloran Estate auction just outside Millbrook, Iowa, and the object that had just changed hands was a squat, iron-bound Notary's Strongbox, dented on one corner. The man who had bought it did not laugh back. He simply nodded once at the auctioneer, folded his numbered card, and walked toward the pay window with the slow, even step of a man who had never in his life hurried for anyone. His name was Emmett Fry, and he was 69 years old that spring. He had the long, lean frame of a man who had spent 50 years bent over benches and workpieces, and his shoulders had begun their permanent stoop toward the ground he had studied so long. Wore a canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows, a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, and a dark work cap pulled low. His face was deeply lined, the kind of face where the writes on slowly, and his eyes were the pale, steady gray of river ice. His hands were what people noticed first, if they noticed him at all. They were scarred across the knuckles, the fingertips broad and slightly flattened, the nails cut short and clean. They were a locksmith's hands, and they had been shaping and coaxing metal in the little shop behind his house on Poplar Street since 1938. Delbert Voss was 49, heavy through the middle, clean-shaven and ruddy, with a gold ring on his right little finger and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his arm. He owned Voss Home and Farm Realty out on the highway, and he drove a bone-white Lincoln that he parked crooked across two spaces, because, as he liked to say, he could afford the ticket. That morning he wore a sport coat the color of a mustard jar over a shirt open at the collar, and he stood in a knot of men near the truck gate, talking with the pleased, carrying voice of a man who did not care who heard him.
$85,
Delbert said, when Emmett walked past with the Strongbox cradled against his hip. $85 for a chunk of pig iron with a busted lock. Emmett, you buy that for a doorstop or a boat anchor. The men around him laughed, the way men laugh when they are not sure yet whether the joke is funny. Boat anchor, Delbert decided loud for the crowd. That's what that is. Fry bought himself a boat anchor, and he don't even own a boat. Emmett did not answer. He walked to his old green Ford, a 1961 half-ton, with the paint gone chalky on the roof, and he set the Strongbox down on a folded moving blanket in the bed. He did not set it down hard. He arranged it the way a man arranges something he intends to know. The Strongbox was a Hallowell & Sons Notary safe made in Cincinnati sometime around 1905, iron-bodied with a nickel steel liner and a lever tumbler lock of the old Chubb pattern, 6 levers, a false gate, and a curtain that dropped over the keyway when the bolt was thrown. It weighed 62 pounds empty, and it had spent the last 31 years in the back closet of a country notary named Silas Halloran, who had died a bachelor in 1981 and whose estate had finally come to auction that Saturday. What no one at the auction knew, and what Emmett Fry could not yet have known either, was that the Strongbox had not been opened since the evening of the 8th of November, 1952, when Silas Halloran had turned the key one last time and hidden it, had suffered the stroke that took his speech and half his memory and left him a quiet man in a rocking chair. For the rest of his long life, Emmett had seen two things at the preview table that morning that no one else had bothered to see. The first was the brass plate. Someone had tried at some point to pry it off and had failed, and the small tool marks around its edge were not fresh. The second was the keyhole itself. It was choked with lint and grit, yes, but underneath the grit, when Emmett had leaned close and touched a fingertip to the metal, he had felt the faint smoothness of oil. Old oil. Someone had oiled that lock and then packed the keyhole to hide the fact. A man does not oil a lock. He means to leave forever. Emmett had learned lockwork from a Welshman named Owen Price, who had come to Iowa in 1922 and set up a shop above a barber's on Center Street, and had taken Emmett on as an apprentice in the spring of 1934, when Emmett was 20 years old and had nothing in his pockets but a folding knife. Owen Price had been a small, precise man with a walrus mustache and a habit of humming hymns while he worked, and he had said many things that Emmett had carried the rest of his life. But the one Emmett thought of most often, "A lock, boy," Owen would say, tapping the workbench with the flat of his file. "A lock is a promise between two people, and if you are a locksmith worth your bread, you do not break the promise. You ask it politely." Emmett had asked a great many locks politely in the 49 years since. He had opened bank vaults after floods, and he had opened the little brass padlocks that farm children hung on their diaries. And he had opened a wall safe once for a widow in Cedar Rapids that had turned out to hold nothing but her husband's fishing licenses going back to 1919. He had learned that locks were rarely about what was inside them. Locks were about the person who had turned the key, and about what that person had believed, at that moment, was worth keeping. The drive home from the Halloran place took 40 minutes on the county roads, and Emmett drove all of it at 45 miles an hour, with the Strongbox riding steady on its blanket in the bed of the truck, and the March sun coming pale through the windshield. He thought as he drove about Silas Halloran, whom he had known slightly, the way you know a man in a small town who has notarized 3 or 4 documents for you over the course of your adult life. Silas had been a thin man with a stiff collar and small round glasses, and he had always used a fountain pen, even when everyone else had gone to ballpoints, and he had always signed his name with a small ornamental loop under the S. He had been, by every account Emmett had ever heard, an honest man, which Emmett had come to believe over the course of his life was a rarer thing than the phrase made it sound. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. Emmett had lived his whole life on the near side of that moment, and he had never much minded. He had a small house, a small shop, a small pension from the war, and a wife who had been dead 11 years and whose photograph he still kept on the kitchen windowsill so she could see the birds at the feeder. He did not need much. He did not want much. He had bought the Strongbox because a lock had spoken to him, and he had answered. By Monday afternoon, the story of Emmett Fry's boat anchor, Delbert Voss had told it at the Elks lunch, and at the counter of the Rexall, and at the pump island of the Sinclair station, and by Tuesday morning it had reached the back booth of the Blue Star Diner, where the retired men gathered at 6 for coffee and stayed until 9. Harlan Beebe, who had been Emmett's friend since the 3rd grade and who had never in his life been able to keep a thought behind his teeth, drove out to Poplar Street on Tuesday evening and stood in the door of the shop with his hands in his coat pockets. "Met," Harlan said. "Delbert's telling everybody you paid $85 for a paperweight." Emmett was at his bench, under the yellow cone of his gooseneck lamp, and he had the Strongbox up on a folded towel, and he was doing nothing to it, only looking at it the way a man looks at a horse before he decides how to approach. "It'll open," Emmett said. "You sure it'll open?" Harlan stood there another minute, and then he nodded, and then he left, because he had known Emmett Fry long enough to know that there was no third sentence coming. Emmett worked on the Strongbox for 9 evenings. He did not force it. He did not drill it. Drilling was for men in a hurry, and men in a hurry, Owen Price had said, made poor locksmiths and worse husbands. On the first evening, Emmett cleaned the keyhole. He used a soft brass pick and a small camel hair brush and a little glass jar of solvent that his wife had bought him for Christmas in 1968. And he drew out of the keyway a surprising quantity of matted lint, 3 grains of rice, and at the very back, the waxed paper, when Emmett unfolded it under his lamp, was blank. It was not a message. It was a plug. Silas Halloran had plugged his own keyhole to keep the levers from resting in their natural position, which meant that Silas Halloran had understood, at least a little, how his own lock worked and had wanted to make it harder for a stranger to open. On the second evening, Emmett took impressions. He used soft lead and a length of straightened wire, and he coaxed each of the 6 levers up in turn and read their gates, the way a blind man reads a face. He wrote the numbers down on a yellow legal pad in his small, careful hand, and when he was done, he had a diagram of the lock as complete as if he had held its key. On the 3rd and 4th evenings, he cut the key. He used a blank from a drawer of old blanks that Owen Price had left him in 1959, when Owen had finally retired to a sister in Ohio, and he cut it slowly, filing between each cut and testing each cut against the diagram. And by the end of the 4th evening, he had a key that would enter the lock and turn against the first 2 levers before it stopped. On the 5th evening, it stopped again at the 4th lever, and Emmett understood that Silas Halloran had done something else. He had added a lever, a 7th lever, hand-fitted, tucked behind the false gate, riding on a spring so light it barely resisted the pick. It was a small, beautiful piece of work, and Emmett sat back in his chair and looked at it under the lamp for a long time. "You careful, man," he said out loud to no one, and to Silas Halloran, wherever he had gotten to. "You careful, careful, man." On the 6th and 7th evenings, Emmett cut a new key. On the 8th evening, he polished it. On the 9th evening, which was the 21st of March, 1983, a Monday, with a thin rain falling on the tin roof of the shop and the radio in the corner playing a farm report about hog prices in Sioux City, Emmett Fry put the key into the lock of the Strongbox and turned it, and the bolt slid back with a sound like a held breath finally letting go. He did not open the lid right away. He set the key down on the towel, and he wiped his hands on a rag, and he sat for a full minute with his palms flat on the bench, because he had learned a long time ago that the moment before a thing is known is not a moment to hurry through. Then he lifted the lid. Inside the Strongbox, laid neatly on a folded square of green baize, were 3 things. The first was a manila envelope tied with red string, and inside the envelope, when Emmett untied it, were 42 documents, each one an original deed, mortgage release, or affidavit, notarized by Silas Halloran between the years 1946 and 1952. Who had once owned a farm of 418 acres on the west side of the county, and who had lost that farm. So the story had always gone, because old Nathan Alderman had drunk it away and mortgaged it 3 times over before he shot himself in the equipment shed in the spring of 1953. The documents in the envelope told a different story. They told the story of a man named Curtis Vogler, who had held the 2nd and 3rd mortgages on the Alderman place, and who had, According to a sworn affidavit signed by Nathan Alderman himself on the 3rd of November 1952, forged Nathan's signature on a loan renewal, altered the interest rate, and pocketed the difference for 6 years running. There was a letter from a bank in Des Moines confirming the discrepancy. There was a photostat of the forged signature next to 2 genuine ones. There was a handwritten log, in Silas Halloran's small, careful script, of every date on which Curtis Vogler had come to his office to notarize a document that Silas, upon later examination. The second thing in the strongbox was a canvas sack, and inside the canvas sack were 184 $20 gold pieces wrapped in tissue paper in rolls of 10, and a small ledger indicating that this was the sum Nathan Alderman had given to be held for his daughter Ruth against the day the truth could be proved. The third thing was a letter, sealed in a plain white envelope, addressed in fountain pen ink to whoever opens this. Emmett Fry lifted the letter out of the strongbox and slit it with his pocket knife and unfolded 2 pages of thin onion skin, and he read what Silas Halloran had written on the evening of the 8th of November, 1952. To whoever opens this, the letter began. My name is Silas J. Halloran, and I am the notary of record for Prescott County, Iowa. If you are reading this, then I have not lived to bring the enclosed documents before the court, and I ask you now to do what I could not. The papers in this box will prove that Curtis Vogler defrauded Nathan Alderman of his farm, and that the debts recorded against the Alderman name are false debts. I have with me also the sum of $3,680 in gold, which Nathan placed in my keeping for his daughter Ruth, who is 14 years old at this writing, and who will one day need to know that her father was not the fool the county will say he was. He was a proud man and a tired man, and he was cheated, and there are worse things than being cheated, but not many. I would ask you to carry these papers and this money to Ruth Alderman, if she yet lives, and if she does not, then to her children, and if there are no children, then to the county attorney, so that Curtis Vogler may answer at last. I have not brought it forward myself, because Vogler has friends in this county, and I am one old man with a bad heart, and I judged it safer to hide the truth well than to speak it poorly. That was perhaps a coward's choice. Whoever you are, I trust you now because you have done what I could not do, which is to open this lock. A man who can open a lock is a man who understands that some doors are meant to be walked through and not broken. Please walk through this one. Yours, Silas J. Halloran. Emmett Fry sat at his bench a long time with the letter in his hands. He could have kept it. He could have kept the gold, which was worth, at 1983 prices, something over $100,000. He could have burned the papers, which named a man whose son, Marlon Vogler, still lived in a big house on the north end of Millbrook, and still sat on the boards of 2 banks and the school. He could have said nothing, and lived out his life in his small house on Poplar Street, and no one, not one soul on earth, would ever have known. Silas Halloran had been dead 2 years, and no one in all of Prescott County was waiting for the truth about a farm lost in 1953. Emmett folded the letter along its old creases and put it back in its envelope. He drove out the next morning, Tuesday the 22nd of March, 1983, to a small tan house on a side street in Ottumwa, 63 miles south, where Ruth Alderman Beecher, now age 45, worked afternoons at a fabric store, and lived with a diabetic husband and a grown son who was a mechanic in Peoria. Emmett had found her through the county clerk, patiently, over the course of a single Tuesday morning of telephone calls, and he had asked her only whether she was the daughter of Nathan Alderman of Prescott County, and when she had said yes, in a careful voice, he had said he had something of her father's that he needed to bring to her, and would 11 o'clock the following morning be all right. She met him at the door in a house dress and a gray cardigan, and she had the tired dignity of a woman who had spent 45 years being the daughter of a man everyone said had thrown his life away. Emmett took off his cap in her front hall. He set the Strongbox on her kitchen table. He laid out the papers and the gold in the letter, and he said very little because there was very little for him to say. He said, "Your father did not do what people said he did. This will show you why. This is yours. He meant it for you." He waited while she read the letter, and when she began to cry quietly into the sleeve of her cardigan, he stood up and put on his cap and let himself out the front door before she could think to thank him, because he had not driven 63 miles to be thanked. He had driven 63 miles because a man in 1952 had trusted a lock, and Emmett Fry had answered the lock politely, and one did not, after such a conversation, ask to be paid. The county attorney reopened the alderman matter in April. Curtis Vogler had been dead 19 years, but the estate he had left to his son Marlon was, by the state's own laws, subject to civil recovery on grounds of demonstrable fraud, and by the following autumn, Ruth Alderman Beecher had received a settlement large enough to pay off her husband's medical bills from the family that had held it for 3 decades, 40 acres of what had once been her father's land. She built no house on it. She simply walked it in the evenings when she could get up to Prescott County, and she planted, along the fence line, a row of young oaks. Delbert Voss said very little that spring. He was not directly involved in the Vogler business, but he had for years done a great deal of realty work with the Vogler family, and when the papers in Des Moines picked up the story of the Notary's Strongbox and the $85 auction, and the old locksmith who had spent 9 evenings in his back shop opening a promise made in 1952, Delbert Voss found that his telephone did not ring quite so often. His Lincoln stayed clean. His sport coat stayed loud. But by the end of 1985, his agency had closed, and by the following spring he had, as people in Millbrook said, moved south, and no one in the Blue Star Diner spoke his name much after that. The Strongbox itself now sits in a glass case in the front hall of the Prescott County Historical Society on Main Street in Millbrook, with a small brass plaque that reads, "Notary Strongbox of Silas J. Halloran, 1905 to 1952. Opened 1983. Returned to its purpose." The key Emmett cut is in the case beside it, on a length of red string. Emmett Fry went once in the evening of a summer Sunday in 1984, when the Historical Society was closed and the street was empty, and the light through the front window was the color. He stood on the sidewalk with his cap in his hands, and he looked at the Strongbox in its case for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he put his cap back on his head, and he walked to his old green Ford, and he drove home to Poplar Street, where a young man named Toby Hendrick, 22 years old and quiet as a held breath, was waiting on the shop step to begin his 2nd year of apprenticeship. Emmett unlocked the shop and turned on the lamp and set his hands on the bench, and Toby, who had learned already not to speak first, waited. "A lock," Emmett said at last, "is a promise between 2 people." and if you are a locksmith worth your bread, you do not break the promise. You ask it politely to let you in." Toby nodded and picked up his file and bent to his work. "So I will leave it with you. If you had been the one to open that strongbox on a rainy Monday evening in 1983 alone in a small shop on Poplar Street with 184 gold pieces on the bench in front of you and no living soul who knew what you had found, would you have driven 63 miles the next morning to a tan house in Ottumwa and left before you could be thanked, or would you have closed the lid and kept your quiet and told yourself that a truth 30 years old was a truth the world had already learned to live without?